Good morning. This is Arlan Suderman, Chief Commodities Economist at StoneX, coming to you from the trading floor around 9 a.m. on Monday, January the 5th. And the news of the weekend was the U.S. strike on Venezuela to arrest and take into custody President Maduro of Venezuela on mostly drug trafficking, drug conspiracy charges, weapons charges, etc. And he's appearing in a New York courtroom today to face those charges. The question is, where do we go from here, and what implications does that have for the commodity markets? And that's where it gets a little bit more interesting as we go forward, and something that I think we need to pay attention to. Obviously, Venezuela is known for its crude oil production. In fact, if you look at its reserves of crude oil, its known reserves, they're the largest of any country in the world. So that makes it an interest to everyone in the world right there. Much of that oil has been sanctioned of late. And in fact, President Trump and his forces have been striking at shadow fleet ships who have been trying to transport that oil against those sanctions and seizing those ships. But that also allowed them an excuse to get military assets close enough to Venezuela to carry out this action that took place over the weekend. Now, who was the buyer of that oil? That's the first clue going forward. It was largely China that was benefiting from that cheap oil. China has invested in Venezuela, helped to float their economy. Um, Venezuela was indebted economically to China, and that allowed China then to leverage that indebtedness to get that cheap oil from Venezuela. It's a heavy crude oil that comes from Venezuela, and our refiners need that as well in their refining process. So crude oil probably doesn't change a whole lot in the near term, and that's why the market has largely priced that in, and we're actually going higher with prices to start this week and as we return to more normal conditions on Wall Street. Longer term, if in fact that we're able to see a safe and healthy transition of power in Venezuela and bring about economic reform in Venezuela and allow the private companies to come in and develop it again, the opportunities are tremendous there for crude oil production and being able to extract that from Venezuela via exports and to help that country economically. But that's going to take some time and maybe 2 to 3 years or longer for this to really all play out. But I think the more interesting, and I should say one other thing before we go forward. I talk about crude oil, but Venezuela is also an importer of U.S. corn, soybeans, wheat, soybean oil, soybean meal. And I don't see that as a significant market factor right now. Obviously, a healthy economy and improved relations with the United States might help improve those imports going forward, but I don't see that as a major market factor at this point. But where it does become a potential market factor is where I'm going next, and that is China. So, what does China have to do with this? China has been greatly investing in South America in various ways. Probably the most significant has been this big port that they opened up um, and had big investment in Peru. And now they're also involved in the planning, development, and construction of this rail line to connect that port across the Andes Mountains with all the territory of Brazil going all the way to the east coast of Brazil. Now, that's going to take some time to build. Once it does, it'll allow it to pull all of the vast commodity resources of Brazil to the West Coast South America to more economically imported into China. And that is a factor longer term for the United States. But it's also getting an established base in South America, and President Trump sees that as a threat. President Trump doesn't want to go to war directly with China, but he is fighting somewhat of a proxy war, so to speak, on making strikes to countries that are strategic to to China as it tries to engage its strategy. For example, its support for Iran, and we directly struck Iran. Its support for providing weapons to Hezbollah, and we supported the strikes against Hezbollah. and dramatically weakened it. Now Venezuela is yet another front on which we have inflicted damage, so to speak, to China's strategy. And President Trump seems to be following a revised or his version of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine goes back to, I believe it was 1823, when it was a declaration that Europe should stay away from the Americas and not interfere with the business of the Americas, that United States would take that as a direct attack on it, an affront to it, that the Americas, from the standpoint of business and economically, were a unit of in and of themselves economically. And so now it's not a focus on Europe, but it's a focus on China and China's investments in the Americas, and particularly in Latin America. And Venezuela is a place where China was specifically targeting to establish a base there. It would be in the Caribbean Sea, just to the south of the United States, to establish a presence there in this oil-rich nation. So the United States is essentially putting its stake down against that at this point. Now, the talk in China today is, what impact does this have on Taiwan and China's commitment to quote unquote reunify Taiwan to China? Does it speed up the timetable or not? Now, President Trump and President Xi both have reasons to want to have that truce declared with a handshake on October 30th continue. They would rather not have direct conflict at this point because President Xi needs to focus on issues at home with China's economy, and President Trump needs to return certainty to the U.S. economy so that it can thrive ahead of the midterm elections, because he cannot afford to lose Congress in the midterm elections if he desires to continue with his agenda. So they're walking a fine line here of confrontation, but yet under a truce, so to speak. And this is just another step within that. Now, there's thinking that this could speed up, as I said, China's move on Taiwan, but that's not likely to happen unless the United States moves troops into Venezuela for a longer period of time to maintain peace on the streets. That's going to really depend on how well the United States can manage this power transition in Venezuela, and if they can do so in a way that maintains peace in the streets of Venezuela. If it does not, then troops may have to go into Venezuela to maintain the peace. And if that happens, that may speed up the timetable for China to take action against Taiwan. If in fact that were to happen, that continues to be, as I've said before, Taiwan is the one probably biggest flashpoint that could undo the truce of October 30th. If China would go in, and let's assume that they were successful in quickly moving on Taiwan and taking control of Taiwan, the United States, and President Trump in particular, I believe, would feel a need to respond in the most likely way based on his previous actions that I would expect him to respond would be some type of action impacting trade, um, whether it be return of heavy tariffs or whatever it might be, however we might do it. It would put trade with China at risk. That's both in the way of consumer products coming to the United States, but also ag and energy commodities going to China. So the example that's been talked about so much in recent weeks has been this trade deal with China, with the handshake agreement October 30th, which is still not completely negotiated yet. We still don't have a finished deal that we can read and look at. But the soybeans part of it, China has, we believe, purchased about 9.5 million metric tons of soybeans, and that's about 3 million metric tons more than what USDA has confirmed to this point. We believe they're getting closer to that 12 million metric ton level. But taking shipment of those soybeans could all fall apart if we would see some action against Taiwan. That's the bottom line where I'm going, in addition to other commodities as well. So it's a risk we have to respect going forward. And one of those keys is our action in Colombia. For now, I wish you a happy new year, and be sure to like and subscribe if you want to continue to get these updates from the trading floor.